Bible bashing, a tragic turn in the Kanye saga, and the truth about campus agitators. That and more on today's Higher Ground. I'm Billy Hallowell, and we're going behind the headlines today with CBN's Goins Phillips and the Washington Times Valerie Richardson. Trey and Valerie, how you guys doing today?
Great.
Good.
Thanks for having us, Billy.
Yeah, happy to be
Well,
here.
happy to have you both here, and there is no shortage of chaos to talk about. And I don't know, before we get started, do you guys lose your minds ever during the day as you're seeing stories that you want to cover and there's so much chaos, I feel like we can't keep up with it, right?
No, it's one of those big news waves. I call it surfing the news wave, and right now we're at high tide. So
I know, and to think that it's an election year, so there's more waves to come.
Oh my gosh, don't remind me. Yeah. Well, this story that you covered, Val, I want to start here. And I love, like, on this podcast, we get to really go behind the headlines and unpack them. And a lot of people are having questions about these campus protests. What's really going on? Who's really funding it? You have a story about the fact that nearly half of these anti-Israel, student protesters that have been arrested at a couple of the schools that we've seen, they're actually not students at all. Tell us a little bit about this one.
yes, after the NYPD went into Columbia and City College of New York a couple of days ago, made about almost 300 arrests. Then they started, processing who was arrested and came up with the figures that 47% of those that they arrested, in other words, nearly half, were not actually students. But they were all on. I mean, at Columbia, that encampment is on campus. It's right in front of the Butler Library on the West Lawn. So you have, and even though the campus had been shut down for several days, you had people who had apparently no affiliation, were not faculty, were not staff, were not Columbia students on that campus living in those encampments. And at this point, we're kind of trying to figure out who these people are. It seems like some of them, you hear things here and there. And then the NYPD did release a little bit of information about this, but basically what you're seeing are a lot of people who are kind of like, professional protesters, people who you saw at Occupy and you've seen at other things. That's what Mayor Eric Adams said. He says, these are people who are known to us. We've been, running into them at protests for years. And it almost sounds like they're sort of protest jumpers. They just like to mix it up and be in the middle of it. But some of them are also very experienced in this and know how to run know how to escalate a protest. And the feeling is that when the Columbia students went from having their tents on the lawn to breaking into Hamilton Hall and barricading themselves inside and putting a pro-Hamas banner out front, that this was an example of the professional protesters telling them how to do this, because they had zip-tied furniture together to form blockades. They knew how to. They broke windows in a certain way to break into the building. They had the equipment they needed. In other words, it was more of a professional thing. Your average student would not have known how to do this.
That seems like a safety issue to me, right? That you have all these unaffiliated people on a campus where you have students, obviously outside of the issues we've talked about with Jewish students in general, the safety issue of random strangers who are potentially being incentivized to be there for some reason. That just seems a little terrifying.
It's a huge safety issue, and that is why Columbia, despite promising the previous week, we won't bring in the police again, they brought in the police again because they sort of had to. They were, the NYPD had they had their people on the ground and in drones, and they kind of knew who was there, and they told them, you have a lot of outsiders here, and if one of those outsiders, those outside professional agitators, or who knows is there, maybe people with mental health issues you don't even know, maybe people with criminal records, and if one of those people winds up hurting somebody, you're going to be liable for this. And Columbia was like, okay. So they went in and and made all the arrests, and now the encampment has been cleared. They've taken back Hamilton Hall. Columbia is determined to have their graduation, which is scheduled for May 15th, and it looks like they're going to be able to do it.
Wow.
These stories to me are just insane. Like, look at all of the legacy media, and there's no real coverage of the fact that these are probably being organized by professional protesters, which, by the way, what is a professional protester? Like, if you go to school to be a community organizer, is this what you do now? Like, now you just organize protests, and then how do you make money? Is it I know that a lot of these protests, they'll have like, scan this Venmo card and then you can donate to us. Like, are we just donating so that you can get McDonald's as you hop from one protest to the next?
Well,
Like,
actually, they did show a woman named Lisa Fithian. The NYPD showed video of her. She was on the ground. She's 63 years old. She's known as, quote, Professor Occupy because she was there at Occupy Wall Street. And
You can't make this stuff up.
apparently she makes $300 a day from activist groups and unions, helping them run demonstrations and teach their members how to do it. This was a big Mother Jones profile in 2012. so
Wow.
and she's apparently being paid by people who want to put on demonstrations, and so the fact that she was there at Columbia, I mean, unless she was doing this pro bono, is kind of an indication that somebody was paying her.
Well, the
Oh
other
my gosh.
question too that I have, Billy, is if these were Christian groups going onto a campus, can you imagine the coverage? Like if they were outside groups going on to, I mean, obviously that we have parachurch ministries that do that kind of stuff, but I'm saying if there was something this massive that was more a protest in nature that went on to, I mean, just the deep dives that like all of the magazines, big legacy outlets would be going into, which whatever, if they want to cover that, they can cover that. But I'm just saying the disparity in how we cover things, the lack of intellectual curiosity about these protests that are happening on college campuses around the country is mind-boggling to me. As a journalist, I would be fascinated to dive into it regardless of who was doing it. I'd want to know, where is this coming from?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's it's a really good question. It's hard to track the money because you got big
Oh,
foundations
for
out there
sure.
like Rockefeller and those the big left wing foundations that contribute to groups that support these groups, but who's actually passing checks to people who what how much money is there, and nobody really knows this, but there does seem to be money flowing into these. One thing that a lot of people noticed, including the mayor Eric Adams, was how come all these kids have identical tents? Like, did they all just go to find a big sale at Lowe's? It looks like they're being supplied by somebody who brought them all the same tent, and that's not just at one campus. Apparently, at campuses nationwide, these tents are very similar and or like the same, which makes it look like somebody bought a bunch of tents in bulk and started passing them out. So we don't really know what's happening behind the scenes, but it's definitely much more organized than, as you say, the mainstream media would be reporting.
Well, and it's like they've tried to even dismiss some of that in the media. The tents, the students went and bought them. They just brought them with them. And it's like, well, I find it very odd that they're all the same. And we know that there's got to be something more to that. And so it's some of the dismissals of this. And to your point, Trey, if this were other groups, I mean, this would not be tolerated. But yeah, I mean, look, I feel for these schools in a sense because they are dealing with a lot here and they haven't handled it well. Some of the schools are even negotiating with these student groups, obviously, to come. Northwestern is one of them. And when you look at the terms of these negotiations, it's like, I get that you're trying to get around having this chaotic police presence, but you're negotiating with people who might not even be students potentially when you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, who
Well,
knows? It's wild.
Right.
it's definitely like you were saying, Valerie, at the top of this conversation. It's at least, like at the very least, this is a safety issue. I remember, so I went to Liberty University in Central Virginia, and when I was a student there, obviously we had a lot of political speakers, presidential candidates, whatever, come and speak on campus. And I think this was a graduation one year, maybe. We had a high-profile politician, I don't remember who it was, coming to speak on campus, and there were some uh, protesters who wanted to protest whoever the candidate or politician was. So they were adults who live in Lynchburg but are not affiliated with the school, went onto the campus and were protesting. And I remember them being pretty swiftly removed. It was just a small group. But then here in Lynchburg, there was all of this criticism of Liberty University for not allowing people to practice their free speech, whatever. And then Liberty said, "Well, this is a private institution. We don't know who you are.
Hmm.
This is not safe for you to be. You can go across the street from the campus and do whatever you want to. That's on public lands. But yeah, I think we should at least be concerned about the safety of these students who are on campus, regardless of their political affiliation."
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are going to be revisiting this, I'm sure, because I don't think it's anywhere near over and just crazy, crazy times to be covering this. But Val, thanks for bringing that one. And Trey, you have one. I mean, talk about a hard topic shift here, Kanye West. But we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off and go right into it. This story is really interesting because Brittany De La Mora, she's an ex-adult film star, an ex-porn star, who has
Yeah.
become an amazing Christian speaker and just podcaster. And she had quite a bit to say about this recent report on Kanye. Can you kind of break this one down for us, Trey?
Yeah, I think this story is both really fascinating and heartbreaking. It's like the car accident on the highway that you obviously are kind of jarred by, but you also don't want to look away from. But so Kanye had this huge explosion of faith, had this coming to Jesus story several years ago now. In 2019, he released his first Christian hip hop album. He started hosting these Sunday services. I know a lot of the listeners will probably remember that. I mean, we covered it a ton at CBN, and we weren't the only ones. It was getting a bunch of secular and faith-based coverage because it's Kanye West. He's a huge star. He was married to Kim Kardashian at the time. So for him to go from that into then obviously delving into politics and being kind of all over the place on political issues, also making some remarks that were a lot of people said were anti-Semitic, and he apologized for those, and then kind of walked back some of that apology and made kind of doubled down in what he was saying. So there's a ton there that we don't have the time to get into. But then so he goes from that moment in 2019 to then 2024. And he's remarried now and is saying that he is not only going to launch a pornography website, but actually wants to launch a pornography studio, which aside, like setting aside the faith issue, he's also talked about pornography addiction and that being kind of the genesis of his fall into sin, sexual sin and otherwise. The reason he went down many of the dark paths he went down, he said years ago, is because of an addiction to pornography, which he was first introduced to, by the way, at 5 years old when he picked up a Playboy magazine that his dad left out in the open in their house. So it's just kind of mind boggling the whiplash you kind of get with Kanye's story. And Brittany De La Mora, as you said, she recently joined us on Faith versus Culture over at CBN News. And she just said, really pleaded with Kanye, please don't launch this pornography site. She said, I think Kanye is such a creative genius. I believe that his gifts are given to him by God, and it's devastating to see him wanting to use his gifts to serve Satan and not God. She went on to say it's really heartbreaking. So it's kind of a wild story, and there's a lot of different directions we can go in. So I'll leave it to you to decide where you want to pick up and what angle you want to kind of hone in on.
Yeah, Val, I'll come to you in a second, but I will say it's ironic to me that, and Brittany's phenomenal. I mean, she's great. I've worked
Oh
with
yeah.
her. But that you have an ex-porn star lecturing Kanye West, who was, bringing gospel choirs around the country to churches, about not doing this thing that she used to do, right? That she's come out of. And I think to me, the biggest cautionary tale is, I think it's really, a lot of people jump on board when there's a celebrity who's suddenly agreeing with their viewpoint or their theology or whatever it is. Even on politics, this happens. And, we got to be a little more careful probably with that. I've been guilty of it too, because when something like this happens, you're in a position of saying, oh my goodness, maybe we had this wrong. I mean, it's just sad.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are, Val.
Oh, all I would say, as you were talking, Trey, what I was thinking was, Kanye was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2016, and
Yeah.
I think that's maybe the only way you explain it. His swings back and forth, on this issue.
Well, I think something really interesting too, and Brittany talked about this. So, anyone interested, you can go over to the CBN News YouTube channel. You can watch our full faith versus culture conversation with Brittany. But she talked about as somebody who has been delivered out of the pornography industry, out of sexual sin, and is now living for Christ and running a ministry and helping other women, by the way, who are still in pornography, and also helping women who are addicted to pornography. So she's kind of on both sides of that conversation. She said, I think Kanye probably had some false understandings about the Lord, that he took these things to God, issues with his marriage, issues maybe with his personal life, and maybe even his mental health. And she said maybe those prayers were not answered the way that he thought they should be answered, and he didn't fully understand what it means to surrender to God and to hand those things over to God and to consistently seek the Lord in the midst of those things. But because in the short term he didn't get exactly what he thought he should have gotten, when it came to all of these different issues, he kind of decided to dismiss God and go back inward and start, to find solutions within himself, and probably went back into some of those addictions that he had before, pornography addictions, because for better or worse, those habits, those sin issues are familiar to us. I think they were probably comfortable to him. Is kind of what she talked about. And then too, the last thing I want to highlight, Billy, is Britney saying, as somebody who obviously was nowhere near as famous as Kanye, but still had some clout and was well known in her industry. Obviously, she said there's a lot of pressure coming out of something like the world that she was in, and then choosing Christ and publicly trying to walk that out and publicly trying to figure out what it means to have a relationship with Jesus. And she said maybe it was just that pressure was just way, way, way too much for Kanye. So she said, as Christians, maybe this is a good cautionary tale, a good warning for us to celebrate, of course, when someone comes to salvation, but then give them privacy to process that by themselves. We shouldn't be propping them up as idols of the faith when they're baby Christians just because they're a celebrity of Kanye's status.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and Val, what you said too about, the mental health aspect, you have sort of the spiritual element that Brittany's talking about. You have the mental health element that, and I'm not saying it's definitively at play here, but we've seen
It
that in the
factors in, I'm
past.
sure.
Yeah. I mean, all of it. Right. And again, like from a comms perspective, jumping on board with people when you're not fully sure, I'm sure there's a lot of pastors and churches right now that are kind of thinking, oh boy, maybe maybe we shouldn't have done that, or maybe we shouldn't have gone all in. But at the same time, understanding that people go through ebbs and flows in life. And I mean,
Yeah.
what a strange story though. It really is.
Yeah.
It's always something with Kanye. It does seem
It,
like.
It,
well, and
that's
that is so true. And I think the good news as Christians is we remain hopeful in all of this stuff, right? So even if it looks crazy right now, and Kanye is always throwing everybody for a loop, the Lord can always do an incredible work of redemption in anybody's life. So Kanye is obviously not an exception to that. So I guess the takeaway is to continue to pray for him in the midst of craziness.
And to remember, as Valerie said, there's always something with Kanye
Yeah.
to
Oh, right.
consider. So,
100%.
all right. So our final story, and we won't spend too much time on this one, but I think it's worth talking about because a popular actor, Brian Cox, he got himself. I mean, this is why we can't have nice things, because we all believe in free speech, and then when somebody exercises their free speech and they say something really offensive, you are bound to lose out. And so I often wonder why people do these sorts of things. In this case, the thing that was done was that, and you covered this too, Valerie, as well, but Brian Cox was essentially on a podcast and he started talking about the Bible, God, religion, faith being a figment of people's imaginations. He went into all sorts of different arenas and he went pretty deep into it. I think the thing that he said during this podcast interview, I mean, he's obviously an atheist. When you listen to this interview, it's very clear. And just in case people don't know, I don't think I mentioned this. He was on the show Succession, which was incredibly popular. But he said the Bible is one of the worst books ever. So that was the big one that got people. But he went into the Adam and Eve narrative, calling it stupid, and people who believe it stupid, rather. And basically said all these things are mythology. They're not true. It's propaganda. The Adam and Eve narrative is one that has basically helped the patriarchy, and we need more matriarchy. I mean, he really, there was quite a bit, and he was very calmly talking about it, but it was very evident where he stands on Christianity and faith. One of the most interesting parts, he said, we've created the idea that of God, we've created it as a control issue, which these are very common things that you hear from atheists. I mean, these are sort of the basic atheist critiques of religion. But from my perspective, pulling back, obviously, look, these things are going to offend people of faith. But when I pull back and I look at it, I'm still sort of dumbfounded because I'm thinking, I mean, look, he's 77 years old. Maybe he doesn't really care what happens. Maybe I know he's somebody who shares his perspective freely, but you would assume, and I'll run to you on this first, Val, but from a comms perspective, that somebody might have said, this isn't the best idea. There's no need to poke the bear because he's kind of done that here.
Right. That's the thing and I think that one thing is that he, for most of his career was more of a supporting actor, did a lot of stage, particularly in Great Britain. He really didn't have like the huge platform that he got once he started with Succession, which I want to say started about 2018. And now he's much more recognizable. And when he says things, they get reported on. And so I think this might be kind of new for him that, when I spout off, people are actually going to write it up. So I think there's that element. But But yeah, he the other thing about him is that he is not just an actor on shows, but he has been for the last 4 years the voice of McDonald's. When you listen to the ads for McDonald's, that is his voice, and he's got this very distinguished, smooth voice. It's a great voice. He's a voiceover artist as well as an actor. But what does McDonald's think about this? And did he think about how this might look for that company? Succession is no longer on the air. It ended, but he's still doing stuff for McDonald's. What do they think about their atheist, anti-capitalist, spokesperson shouting off about how the Bible is stupid and one of the worst books? I have asked McDonald's and they have not responded to me, but I would like to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find so fascinating and interesting, and maybe it's just because of there's just so much spiritual blindness, I think, in the world, and I also think that the gospel is kind of affronting too, right? I mean, the gospel tells us ultimately that we're not in control, that there's a sovereign God that we have to surrender our lives to, and that ultimately He's in control of our destinies, of charting our futures, and I think that is just kind of fundamentally offensive to the human psyche and human experience. So I guess a lot of it is that spiritual kind of blindness that we know we all, apart from salvation, experience and suffer from. So, but it's just fascinating to me. It's like, what is it that like you felt this need to just go on this tirade against the Bible? Like
Hmm.
it's just odd that there's just this desire to attack the Bible, just kind of like just instinctually within so many people, or to attack Christianity. And then you ask them about it, and it's like, kind of to your point, what you're saying, Val, from a marketing standpoint, you ask them, well, there must have been some sort of real motivation. And then they're like, turns out, no, I just wanted to say these things because I don't like the Bible for whatever reason. It's like, do we not think before we insert our feet into our mouths? I guess not.
I mean, if you're that bored, you can just go squat at a college campus at this point. I mean, there's plenty of things to do. I don't,
You can make a lot of money doing that too, apparently. So there's better use of your time, I think.
They're probably making more than we all are combined, these people. I mean, it's crazy. But, well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think people too, again, you're going to get ginned up, you're going to get frustrated, but there's no point getting mad at people. They're going to exercise their free speech. I think the best way, and this is just my advice, it's unsolicited, but the best way to combat something like this is to, speak out with your free speech. Use yours. Don't try to shut somebody else's down. But of course, it's an absurdity. I don't know who his publicist must be screaming right now, because I can't imagine what they've been dealing with all week with this story. But well, look, I appreciate the two of you dealing with me and coming back on this show today, and just appreciate you joining me.
It's been a pleasure, Billy. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, it's been good. I think it's a good reminder too, right? That the best response to speech or bad speech is just better speech overall.
Yep.
But good conversation.
Yep. I love that. Well, we will be back next week with more of Higher Ground. In the meantime, head on over to the Washington Times and Higher Ground to see all the great content over there, and we'll see you again next week.